Good evening, everyone. I'm Robert Smythe, Executive Director of the Hippogriffs History Channel here in London, England. Here I am in front of a replica of the 1607 Godspeed that took the original 104 settlers from Great Britain to North America, thus creating the prelude to the United States of America. In this episode of documentaries about antebellum United States 1812 to 1861, I have the pleasure of introducing 14 distinguished scholars who are experts in this field of American history, all from some of the most prestigious universities in the world. In this episode, I'd like to introduce a renowned scholar and expert in the field of the relationship between slavery and the growth of the US economy, Professor Maya Sijapati, from the University of Chicago. Amongst her notable publications are the National Book Award winners, Southern Plantations and the US Economy, and Indentured Servitude in the 1600s. I will now leave you in her capable hands to discuss life as a house servant in antebellum United States.
Hello, and welcome to the 10th episode of our series on antebellum United States history from 1812 to 1861. In the previous episodes, we discussed life as a northern factory owner, life as a northern factory worker, life in the rural north, life as a woman and child in the north, life as a new immigrant in the north, life as a Chinese immigrant in the west, life as a southern plantation owner, life as a southern plantation owner's wife and child, and life as a skilled slave. I'm Professor Maya Sijapati, a scholar of United States history at the University of Chicago. I will now tell you about life as a house servant in antebellum America. A house servant was someone either enslaved or indentured who was forced or paid to work in another person's home. Slaves were purchased at local auctions and were considered the property of their owners, no personal life outside of their owner's home. On the other hand, indentured servants tended to be white Europeans who came to the United States and worked for their owners for a period of 5 to 7 years. They were paid for their services and were free to leave after their period of servitude was complete. Servants were forced to do whatever task their master demanded of them. They might have been called servants, but a majority of them were enslaved. If enslaved servants disobeyed, they could receive severe punishments. Despite being treated better than plantation field slaves, they were still generally treated badly, but how they were treated really depended on the character of their masters. Some enslaved house servants were as young as 8 years old. By 1800, most indentured servants had been replaced by slaves, but indentured servitude continued until the 20th century. Many house servants were slaves imported from Africa, particularly on the East Coast, close to the equator. They were brought to America against their will and sold at auctions. Some were even sold by their own leaders back in Africa for money. Indentured servants came from Europe in the hope of escaping poverty. Their journey across the Atlantic was paid for by their property owners, and they were expected to work for 5 to 7 years. A contract was written in their homelands before the servants left for America. Some slaves were Native Americans who were driven out of their homes and enslaved before they could flee. House servants performed many daily tasks. Some of the more mundane tasks included maintaining fires, sweeping hearths, sweeping and scrubbing floors, washing and ironing laundry, sewing, watching babies and children, and cooking and serving food. Other, more challenging tasks included carrying wood and water and emptying toilets called chamber pots. Sometimes house servants had specialized tasks. Seamstresses would repair tears in sheets, towels, and clothing. Cooks would cook food for their masters and the other servants in the house. Laundresses would wash, dry, and iron their masters' clothes. Some young enslaved children of African descent watched white children not much younger than themselves. The larger the house, the more chores and jobs there were for them to complete. House servants' clothes varied from master to master. Most received little clothing, just enough to keep warm. Paid or indentured servants could bring their own clothing, but slaves could not. They were given new clothes only twice a year, and all of it was poorly made, as the masters generally bought the cheapest products they could find to save money. House servants were generally given better clothing and housing than plantation slaves. However, they did not receive more or better food. Cooks were responsible for providing their masters and their fellow servants with food, and oftentimes they were cooking lots of food for their masters and their guests and could not make much for themselves and their fellow servants. House servants lived in spare bedrooms and hallways out of sight of the main house, but not too far away. They slept on pallets and mattresses on the floor. The conditions of enslaved servants' rooms were far worse than that of indentured or paid servants, but it was still better than the field slaves. Some indentured and paid servants went home to their families at night instead of staying at their masters' homes. They were only permitted to marry with their master's approval. Paid and indentured servants were generally treated better than enslaved servants, who were usually treated very badly. However, some masters and slaves genuinely cared for each other, so that may not be true in some cases. It mostly depended on who the master and the servants were. House servants were treated much better than plantation slaves, but not as well as skilled slaves. Some may have been treated well, but some were also treated terribly and called names such as lazy, stupid, and clumsy despite all of the work they did. Enslaved house servants were given many punishments if they disobeyed. If they did not follow their master's commands, did the tasks wrong, or attempted to flee their duties, they could receive severe punishments. Some punishments included whipping, imprisonment, torture, and being sold away from their plantations and their families. Sometimes their masters even inflicted these punishments upon their families and forced them to watch. If they were indentured servants, they could have pay deducted from their salaries. Life as a house servant was rough. If they put one foot out of line, they could have pay deducted or have been beaten by their masters. Some servants were indentured or paid for their services instead of enslaved and forced to work. Enslaved servants generally were not set free, but some ran away from their masters. However, indentured servants were contracted to work for a specific amount of time, and after that they could leave or continue working. Paid servants could stop working if they quit, were fired, retired, or got pregnant, but they would stop receiving compensation until they began their jobs again. Their masters were generally rich families of European descent. They bought slaves and hired servants to work on plantations and in their homes. House servants cooked food for them, cleaned the dishes for them, washed and repaired clothes for them, watched and educated their children for them, and more. Their masters were generally wealthy because slaves were expensive and paid servants required compensation, causing poor citizens not to be able to afford to hire servants or buy slaves. However, some slave owners were African Americans themselves who supported slavery despite their heritage. House servants, along with all types of slaves, left a lasting imprint upon American society. They assisted with the running of households, fields, and factories, helping their masters devote their time to making money. This helped to build up the economy in the long run, making the United States the country it is today. House servants helped clean their owners' homes, watch their children, and cook their food. They, along with other types of slaves and servants, were a large part of the American success story during the antebellum period of U.S. history.